5, 9, 15.
Well, thank you very much. I'm not quite sure how I'm going to follow that, but yeah, I'm very fortunate. I work for a charity that believes dogs are good for us, all of us, and hence our name, Dogs for Good. Now, it was suggested that I come tonight with a dog on the stage, and actually, I think I've been upstaged slightly by Meg in this, but having had experience of doing talks with dogs, I know that actually in reality, you just look at the dog and don't listen to what I'm saying. So, and actually in reality, that's the power of dogs, because they're just hugely interesting to observe and look at all the time, and that's what we do. So we believe in the charity that dogs actually have a huge impact on our health and well-being. Let me just tell you a short story about this boy, Toby, and his beautiful dog Socks. It's hard to believe looking at this boy that 3 or 4 years ago, he told his parents that actually he thought he should end his life because the family would be better off without him. He's on the autism spectrum. He was very angry, he was very anxious, he was very upset all the time. He just couldn't fit into the world. And we gave him this fantastic dog called Socks, and his life has been completely transformed. What you see in this picture is actually just what he is like every day. He's a happy young boy, he's got a future, he's absorbed with his family, and the family are living the life that they never thought was possible, because he's just found a common thread with this dog that has really changed his whole feelings and his behavior. So the reality is that actually dogs can make a huge difference to our health and well-being. We know that actually people who own dogs or people who have access to dogs, they exercise more, so that's good for our physical health. We know that it actually reduces risk of cardiovascular disease. In fact, the American Heart Foundation, if you look on their website, recommend that you have a dog because it's probably the best thing that's going to keep your heart healthy into old age. We know that actually dogs help to deal with immunity to allergies, and that's particularly important for children. We know that they can support our mental health and well-being. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. And we know also that they're fantastic icebreakers, as Barney was saying earlier. When I came to this charity 20 years ago, and it was very small, the first person we worked with, one of our clients I ever met, was a wonderful woman called Janet, who has cerebral palsy. So she walks in quite a slightly unbalanced way, and it takes a little time just for you to tune into her speech. And she said to me that before she had a dog, when she walked down the road, she could see people crossing the road to avoid her because she knew they didn't know how to deal with the fact that she had a disability. But once we gave her one of these really well-trained, wonderful assistance dogs, which helped her in so many ways, she said to me years later, I now see people crossing the road to come and talk to me because they want to find out about this wonderful dog that I have. Now, in many ways, that's a very sad indictment, I think, of our attitudes towards disability. But it does show the power that dogs have to really increase social interaction and change the way we think about it. And if it is going to change our attitudes to disability, well, then that's something that we can celebrate and hope that we can move on into the future. And we also know that people, and there's been quite a lot of research done on this, particularly in Germany, that people who have dogs tend to go to the doctors less often. Sounds strange, but that's what the research shows. So at Dogs for Good, we tend to focus on supporting people with a range of disabilities. We work with adults and children with physical disabilities, children with autism and their families, people with dementia, and also people with learning disabilities. And all the things that I've just talked about, all the health benefits apply to all the people we work with. But in addition, sometimes we're able to work with them to give them greater confidence, perhaps to deal with anxieties, to deal with certain stresses, maybe self-esteem, and a lot of very practical tasks that can allow people to live their lives on a day-to-day basis with more independence. So taking all this into account, one of the things that we're really keen to see is, and try to get, is to get people to understand that actually animals, and in our case dogs, do play a really important part in our national health and well-being strategies, and it's something we don't think enough about. So let me just show you a couple of examples of where the work that we've done, we can apply some of those principles, and you can just see some of the health well-being benefits of people. The first little case study is a very short video of a guy called Andy and his dog Rufus, and I think it speaks for itself.
I became disabled after a cycling accident and my life changed in an instant. I went from being completely able-bodied to being completely paralysed from the neck down. Now I've got Rufus, I was able to do away with an evening care visit because the dog was now able to help me get undressed. They're able to actually help me pull the sport stockings off that I have to wear, help me pull my trousers off, so I get to go to bed what time I want. Plus the fact it saves an awful lot of money for paying care bills, and I can actually come over to the pub for a pint in the evening if I fancy it, rather than thinking, well, I have to wait at home for a carer to come in.
Thank you, Rufus.
I love the social side of it, like looking after the dog, you know, caring for him as well. Got used to people sort of helping my care needs, but it's good for me to be able to sort of look after Rufus and his welfare. It gives me a sense of confidence that I can live in a house on my own, be in a house on my own. My parents have actually said to me that although they're some distance away from me, they are really confident that I'm sort of looked after having the Rufus by my side.
I did say to Andy that I thought it was a bit mean that he didn't buy Rufus a drink, but there you go. You can just see how the price of independence, allowing people to live their lives, not having to have carers do everything for them, is something that most of us will probably never experience. But for people like Andy, that is a real life changer for them. The second case study is one of the services we offer, which is called Family Dog, where we don't train people's dogs, but we work with families of children with autism who have a pet dog or are thinking of getting a pet dog, and just help them make the right decisions to get the best possible outcomes for their families. And this is a young girl called Beth and her dog, Maddie. And before they had the dog, actually, Beth was completely isolated, even within the family. She had nothing to do with the family. She would barely come out of her room. Again, she's a child with autism. She just wasn't really able to communicate at all. But something happened when Maddie came into Beth's life, and she had a real affinity with this dog, and very quickly that she completely changed her personality and became very much part of the family. And here's a good example where we talk about health and well-being. It's not just maybe the person who's interacting most with the dog, but obviously the effect that's had on the whole family. They now do things together as a family. Her siblings, there isn't that pressure in the family where one parent can't do something because they have to stay behind to be with Beth. They can now do things together. So the whole family's health and well-being has been enhanced by that. This is a guy called Mark, who's an adult who has autism. He's a very smart guy, but actually he just has real problems with dealing with social interaction. He's very anxious when he's around people. But actually one of his passions in life is animals, and what he really wants to do is become a volunteer and potentially work longer term at an animal rescue centre. And we've been working with him, Sarah, our member of staff, with one of our trained dogs, to really do a whole series of activities with Mark to help him really gain confidence. And again, it's just those things. You walk down the street with a dog and people will come and talk to him. And he's learning how to develop those social interactions and those skills. And in time, that's going to make a massive difference to his life. My final case study is where we place dogs in schools, again with a dog with a handler working in a school alongside perhaps the teachers or the therapists in special needs schools. So one dog can actually have an effect on many, many different children and deal with them in many different ways. And one particular short story that the children have to have their inoculations every year, their vaccinations, and a school nurse comes in and does this. And this is, for a special needs school, always a tremendously traumatic time, and can often in a school that we're working in with 80 children can maybe take 3 or 4 days because the children get very anxious and traumatized when they have to go through this process. So we started working with the children. Our little dog here, Bertie, when he went to the vet, we took a video of him having his vaccinations, and we worked with the children and explained this isn't Bertie does this and that's good. And when it came around to the time of having their vaccinations, and this has been well recorded in the school nurse practitioner's journal, the children just literally kind of lined up and went in with Bertie, had their injections, and the whole process was done in just over a day, in a process that I said would have taken 4 days. So dogs can really make a huge difference to people's anxieties and really help them through difficult times. So I think it begs the question for us is that why is it then that we don't seem as a society, when we're thinking about policy-related issues, really recognize how important dogs are to our health and well-being? I tell you, if I had £1 for every politician who, when I've explained what we do, says, yeah, I get all that, I've got a dog, and if it wasn't for the dog, I'd be really stressed out, and I wouldn't be getting any exercise, and I'd be anxious, et cetera, et cetera. But yet they never turn that personal into the political and start thinking, well, actually, how does this kind of work in policy terms? And in reality, in policy terms, what we tend to do is make decisions that actually go counter to that. So we have more and more restrictive public space protection orders. It's harder for people living in towns to take their dogs into public places, to free run them, to let them do their natural instincts. And actually what we're doing is storing up more problems, more unintended consequences through doing that. I happen to live in Worcestershire, and I'm a parish councillor in the little village I live in. I went to a fascinating presentation a couple of weeks ago by my district council, Malvern Hills, where they talked about their health and well-being strategy they were rolling out. And there was hundreds of ideas that they had about how they were going to help break social isolation for old people. And in not one did they mention animals in that whole of that thing. I tell you, by the time we'd finished the discussion, they were certainly well on to thinking about animals. So we've just got to start thinking about these things a bit more laterally and come up with ideas. I think it is fair to say that actually we are a bit challenged by the lack of scientific evidence. It's quite hard to measure some of this stuff because it's not like having a pill where you can say it either worked or didn't work and you do these double-blind experiments and tests. So it is a bit hard, and I can see why some people and scientists often are very skeptical about this. But we know there's so much broad evidence, and we know there's so much anecdotal evidence that it's something we have to keep on working on. And we also have to do more to make a compelling economic case to show that actually doing some of these things is much better than some of the strategies we currently work on. And we've just done some research, which has been led by some researchers and economists at Lincoln University, where we did a joint project with them where we've calculated, and I won't go into the details, but there's a little book that's been written about this, but actually the reality of dogs in people's lives is probably saving the NHS about £2.45 billion a year, and that's a very conservative estimate. Now, there are costs of having dogs because, unfortunately, dogs do bite people sometimes, and that costs the NHS about £10 million a year. But we tend to hear a lot about that, but we don't hear a lot about all the benefits and the other ways that we save. So we've got to start thinking a little bit more about how we do this. And just about thinking how some of the benefits that might apply to some key government strategies, I just wanted to say a couple of words. So we know that social care is a huge issue at the moment in the country. And one of the things that we're certainly getting a lot of discussions with local authorities about is how do we deal with the care needs of people who have learning disabilities. Actually, we have choices here. We can either help those people really develop their skills, and maybe in the longer term we can reduce their reliance on having, for example, 24-hour carers, or we can do nothing. And the problem is just going to get worse. And the work we've been doing with young people who have learning disabilities shows that you can do a huge amount through the power of dogs because they're motivated to want to change behaviors and to develop skills and go through developmental changes because they really build this affinity with dogs. When we look at social isolation, we know we've got a growing older population. It's becoming a huge issue for us. How are we going to deal with this? But we don't think very creatively about this. And in our own communities, we could be doing more to deal with this. So, for example, how many of you, I don't know, probably younger people have a dog. go out to work and you're really worried about what to do with the dog during the day, probably 5 doors down the road is an older person who's really lonely and isolated, would actually love to be able to have a dog with them during the day, probably doesn't want to have the commitment of a dog 24/7 because they know they can't look after them. So we need to start facilitating more creative ways of thinking about these in our communities. We've also done a fantastic project with Alzheimer's Scotland looking at working with people with dementia and their carers. And we've been placing some assistance dogs that do some very practical tasks, for example, reminding people to go to the toilet, reminding them to eat, bringing them water so they actually keep hydrated. So some practical things you can do with the person with dementia. But it's often that in national strategies, the whole point is living well with dementia. That's what the national strategy is called. And that means we've got to find ways of allowing people to feel more comfortable staying in their home, and we have to do more to support carers so that actually they're able to cope better. Because if we don't do that, actually the result is people have to go into hugely expensive residential or hospital care, clinical care, and that costs the state a lot of money. And certainly the relatively small pilot we've done have been incredible results, where one couple said to me, you know, our relationship had pretty much broken down. I'm going to look after him because he's my husband, but he sits in a chair all day. We don't really communicate. He's lost all interest in the world. And then we placed a dog with that couple, and suddenly a spark came into that guy's eyes. Now he wants to go out every day. He wants to walk with the dog. He wants to interact again with the community because he's got a dog. When he meets his old friends, there's something to talk about. They've got something going on. And the woman said to me, after the lengthy conversation, and it really touched me, that she said, actually, we've got our lives back together. And in fact, our marriage is probably stronger than it's ever been because something happened when that dog came into our lives. And finally, when we look at the National Autism Strategy, another huge issue that we're trying to deal with, and one of the things the government's very concerned about, that 70% of people with autism who want to work, who are keen to get involved in the economy of the country, but they can't do it because they can't find work or they can't deal with some of the practical and emotional issues of actually dealing with getting to work or in workplace or the workplace environment. But we know dogs could help people enormously with that. And certainly the work we've done, for example, this young woman has autism, has shown that actually we can really help people develop their focus. So we have a kind of slightly different vision, really, of where all this could go. Firstly, we need to recognize that we do live in a multi-species society. So let's, and I don't think I have to convince the audience here because you're all dog lovers, but sometimes I go to these types of events and you can see very hostile people. Yeah, well, the reality is we do live with animals in our society. So let's start embracing that and let's start thinking about how we work with that creatively. We need to create appropriate environments for us to have our dogs, recognizing that they are an integral part of our family and our lives. So let's be a bit more relaxed about some of these public space protection orders. Let's stop things like the horror that we have where we take old people's pets away from them when they go into residential care or they go into sheltered housing. I mean, we're taking people's parts of their family away from them, for God's sake. Now, we need to just design our world differently to allow that to happen. It's not rocket science. We should be doing it. And this should be, someone outside was telling me earlier that it's almost impossible in London to rent a place if you've got a dog. Well, that's wrong. And the unintended consequences of that for people's health and well-being are huge. We also need to create more participative dog programs, the kind of things I was talking about in the communities, and that's where maybe all of us can take some initiative. We can do things in our own communities. We don't always have to be led by local authorities or governments, but we do need support to allow these things to happen. And we need to develop really good participative dog programs that actually allow people to learn more about their dogs. Now, the reality is that not everyone is a responsible dog owner, and that's a problem, and we need to kind of try and find a way of dealing with that. But if we could give people better information, really help them understand the kind of things that John was talking about earlier, really understand their dogs a bit better, how to build a bond with your dog, we could make a huge difference to the way that people perceive dogs. Because at heart, what we want is to have really, really happy dogs. And when we ran a workshop a couple of days ago, a guy came out and he was standing in the reception area, just near my office, and I heard him say to a member of my staff, I used to have dogs when I was young, And now I've come to this workshop because I've got a child with autism and I think I'd love to get a dog. But he said, I didn't get a dog because I thought the only way you could train a dog was to shout at it. And my child doesn't actually like noise, so we've never had a dog. And you've told me, actually, just as John was saying, that's completely the wrong way to go about training dogs. And he went away with a whole new way of thinking about dogs, and that will make a difference to his life. So I think there's a whole load of things that we can do to recognize that dogs do make a difference to our lives. They do enhance our health and well-being. And let's continue, and this tonight has been a fantastic example, let's continue to celebrate all the things that dogs do for us in our lives. Thank you very much.